The pearl gourami is native to Southeast Asia, where it lives in stagnant swamps, slow-moving streams, and along the edges of shallow lakes. And in all of these places where you'll find these fish, there's a dense growth of aquatic plants and very little water movement. These stagnant bodies of shallow water tend to be quite warm and have very low levels of dissolved oxygen, which makes it difficult for most other fish species to survive. But the pearl gourami prefers these inhospitable environments because there's very little competition for resources from other fish and very few aquatic predators. However, in order to survive in these inhospitable places, the pearl gourami needs to overcome 3 different challenges. 1, it needs to be able to cope with the lack of oxygen in these warm, stagnant waters. 2, it needs to be able to move around in dense aquatic vegetation. And 3rd, it needs to be able to find mates and food in water that's often dark and murky, which makes it very difficult for the fish to see. Now let's take a look at the different adaptations that allow the pearl gourami to survive and even thrive in these inhospitable places. All gouramis and their close relatives, the bettas, have gills that are used to extract oxygen directly from the water. But they can also take in air from above the surface of the water and then swallow that air, where it is then sent to a special organ known as the labyrinth organ. This organ is located just above the gills, and it contains a dense network of small passageways that are lined with tiny blood vessels that can extract the oxygen from the air and then send it into the bloodstream. In fact, the pearl gourami is an obligate air breather, which means that it must have access to the air above the water in order to survive. So, as strange as it may seem, if you don't allow these fish to surface for air, they can drown. Nonetheless, the labyrinth organ enables the pearl gourami and its close relatives to survive in stagnant bodies of water that would be off limits to most other fish. The second challenge for the gourami is that it needs to have a body that's shaped in such a way that it can easily move through the dense growths of aquatic vegetation. And the solution was to develop what's known as a laterally compressed body. This shape makes them very thin from side to side, which allows the gourami to pass through the narrow spaces in between the dense growth of aquatic plants. And the third challenge for these fish is that they need to be able to find their way around in water where it can be very difficult to see. These plant-filled waters are often dark and murky due to the large amount of decomposing leaves that release a chemical called tannic acid, which then turns the water dark like tea. So millions of years of evolution solve this problem by adapting the lowermost fins of the gourami to function more like the antenna of an insect rather than the fins of a fish. These long thread-like feelers are actually highly modified ventral fins that have sensitive nerve endings that help the gourami find its way through murky waters in search of food and mates. These paired fins can operate independently of each other and are often as long as the fish itself. Now, many people have said that the gourami uses these modified ventral fins to locate and inspect its food, but I can find no evidence in the scientific literature to show that these fins contain taste buds or any other chemoreceptive cells. I've also never seen them using their ventral fins to find or inspect any food before they decide to eat it. Nonetheless, many fish keepers have repeated this claim with no evidence to back it up, and it looks as if the gourami relies primarily on its vision to find and inspect its food. And the antenna-like ventral fins appear to be used mostly to help them find their way around in water where there's limited visibility. However, they do use their ventral fins to inspect unfamiliar objects placed in their tank, and they even show a preference for using one fin more than the other, similar to how people are either left-handed or right-handed. And from what I've observed, it does seem very likely that these fins are used by the gouramis as a way to communicate with each other, and they might even be used by the male to stimulate the female during courtship. However, this is just speculation on my part, but you can decide for yourself by watching this footage. Personally, I think there's a lot more going on here than we realize. I've also noticed that when these gouramis show aggression towards one another, they never bite at the other fish's ventral fins, which doesn't mean that it won't happen every so often, but I've never seen it. However, if these thread-like fins get broken off or damaged, they will grow back, but you'll want to look into how they got damaged in the first place in order to stop it from happening again, because these long fins play an important role in the life of a gourami. Unfortunately, they also make a tempting target for aggressive fin-nipping species such as tiger barbs, pea puffers, bettas, and serpae tetras. Gouramis also have excellent hearing, and they're capable of making sounds that can be heard from several meters away. So, here are just a few examples of my pearl gouramis making noise. It seems like these noises are made more often by the males, and it's especially common when they're feeding. When setting up a tank for your pearl gouramis, they'll be happiest and most active in a setup that mimics their natural environment as much as possible. Which means that the tank should contain lots of aquatic plants, and it's best to use both floating plants and submerged plants, because pearl gouramis can be very shy at times, and this is especially true if they're kept in a tank that has very few plants and lots of bright light. In such a bare setup, these fish will often hide wherever they can, and sometimes they'll even refuse to eat, so it's best to help them feel at ease by providing them with lots of plants and relatively subdued lighting. Another consideration when setting up their tank is that they don't like a lot of water movement, so it's best to use a sponge filter rather than a hang-on back filter or a canister filter. This particular setup has a dense covering of a floating plant known as frogbit, which allows me to run my sponge filter on high without creating much of a current. And amazingly enough, the constant splashing of water on the frogbit doesn't seem to have bothered it at all. And since these fish construct a bubble nest at the surface of the water when they spawn, it's important that there's not a lot of water movement which would break apart the bubble nest. So this dense layer of floating plants acts like a baffle to keep the surface of the water nice and still for the bubble nest. Of course, this need to limit the motion at the surface of the water is far less important if you don't intend on breeding your fish. A fully grown pearl gourami can reach a length of almost 5 inches, so for a pair of them it's probably best to use a tank that has a capacity of at least 20 gallons. And if you plan on keeping a small group of these fish, it's best to use a 40-gallon breeder tank or even something larger such as a 55 or a 75-gallon tank. However, I've bred pairs of these fish in tanks as small as 10 gallons, but for long-term maintenance, it's best to use the largest tank that you can. And as a general rule, it's best to use tanks that are wide and shallow rather than tall and narrow, because the more surface area that you can provide, the better it will be for your fish. Pearl gouramis seem to like being kept in a small group, but the males can be very aggressive with each other as they reach sexual maturity and prepare to spawn. Then they'll start to claim a portion of the tank as their own. So if you're going to keep a small group of these fish, then it's best to only keep one male and several females. You'll also want to avoid keeping your gouramis with fish that have a reputation for being fin nippers, because the long trailing ventral fins of the gourami makes for a very tempting target. Nonetheless, pearl gouramis are not typically aggressive, so they're a good choice as a centerpiece fish in a community tank with other peaceful species. They get along well with small schooling fish, such as harlequin rasboras, cherry barbs, lemon tetras, and corydoras catfish. They also do well with guppies, cardinal tetras, bristlenose plecos, and amano shrimp. But I'm not sure that I'd trust them with smaller shrimp, such as cherry shrimp. And obviously, you'll want to avoid keeping them with large, aggressive fish like cichlids. It's also important to note that fast-moving fish such as zebra danios may outcompete your gouramis at feeding time, so be sure that your slower-moving fish are getting their fair share of the food. All of the pearl gouramis that you'll find in pet shops have been captive bred for many generations, so they're all pretty adaptable to most public water supplies, and the chances of you coming across a wild-caught pearl gourami are very slim. In fact, wild populations of these beautiful fish are dwindling due to human development, pollution, and several other forms of habitat degradation. Nonetheless, as with any fish, consistency in their water quality is far more important than providing them with the exact water parameters that match their native habitat. Pearl gouramis are not very fussy when it comes to eating, so they'll readily accept any high-quality fish flakes or pellets. Foods that float tend to work best because these fish are adapted for feeding at the surface. It's also important to give them a variety of different foods because no single food product is nutritionally complete. Frozen bloodworms are a nice treat. Just be sure to wash your hands if you come into contact with them because they can cause an allergic reaction in some people. And if you're trying to breed your pearl gouramis, feeding them live, protein-rich foods such as blackworms, mosquito larvae, and baby brine shrimp can also be very helpful. It can be fairly difficult to sex these fish when they're young, but as they mature, the differences between the males and the females becomes much more obvious. On males, the end of the dorsal fin is longer and more pointed than it is on the females, and as the male matures, he'll develop these long extensions on both the dorsal fin and the anal fin. Females do not develop these fin extensions. Furthermore, and a bit less obvious, are the differences in the shape of the body. The body on the males tends to be smaller and have a more slim look to it, while the females tend to have a larger, more rounded body shape. The males are also more colorful than the females, and this difference in color becomes even more obvious when they're preparing to breed. The males develop a vivid reddish-orange coloration along the throat, the anal fin, and on the long, thin ventral fins, while the females do not. In some cases, a subdominant male in a group will not develop the reddish-orange coloration or the fin extensions for quite some time. And this has happened to me in the past, where I thought one of my Pearl Gouramis was a female until I moved her away from the dominant male for a while, and then suddenly her true colors came out and it became obvious that she was a he. Once you've determined that you have both a male and a female and that you'd like to breed them, then it's best to put the pair in a tank of their own. A 20-gallon long tank will work fine, but in a pinch it could be done in a 10. And as long as both fish are sexually mature and healthy, it isn't too difficult to get them to lay eggs. In order to encourage spawning, I feed my breeding pair a high-protein diet that starts with a morning meal of frozen bloodworms, followed by an evening meal of carnivore pellets, and I follow this routine every day. After a while, the sexually mature male will start to develop a bright orange coloration around his throat and lower fins. At this point, I do a 25% water change with water that's about 2 to 3 degrees cooler than the normal tank water. Then, I lower the water level in the tank until it's only about 6 to 8 inches deep. And if everything goes according to plan, the male will then begin to build a nest out of bubbles, and it's best to provide him with a floating object under which he can anchor the bubble nest to keep it in place. In this case, I've used a dense layer of a floating plant called frogbit, but some people use a 3 to 4 inch square of bubble wrap or a similarly sized piece of styrofoam. If you're going to use these last two items, it can be helpful to use a piece of tape or string to anchor them in one place, preferably where there's the least amount of current. During construction of the bubble nest, the male gourami will repeatedly rise to the surface, take a breath of air, and then use that air to blow mucus-coated bubbles in a quiet section of the tank. In my tanks, where I use a sponge filter, the male will usually place the nest as far from the filter as possible so as to avoid having the nest disrupted by the current. And in order to avoid disturbing the bubbles that he's already made, the male usually gets his air from an open spot near the nest where there's no bubbles. While building the nest and preparing to spawn, the male can get very aggressive with other males as well as the female, so it's important to provide the female with some sort of hiding place where she can get away from the male if he becomes too persistent. In this case, the densely planted tank provides plenty of hiding places for her if she needs them. However, in a bare tank, adding a couple of nylon spawning mops will also provide the female with a safe refuge. The female gourami does not participate in the construction or maintenance of the bubble nest. It may take the pair a while to work things out and actually begin to lay eggs, but once they finish spawning, the female will be driven away from the nest area and the male will assume sole responsibility for the eggs and the fry. After spawning, the female should be removed from the breeding tank, and the male will care for the eggs until they hatch, which usually takes about 1 or 2 days. After the eggs hatch, it will take the babies about 3 or 4 days to fully absorb their yolk sac, after which point they'll then be able to swim. And as soon as the young are free swimming, the male should be removed from the breeding tank, and the fry can then begin to feed on newly hatched baby brine shrimp. At this stage, it's very important that the tank has a tight-fitting lid so that the air above the waterline is kept very humid. Otherwise, the labyrinth organ on the young fry will not be able to develop properly. And this organ can take several weeks to fully form, so keep the tank covered as much as possible and keep the water level at a depth of 6 to 8 inches so that the fry can easily reach the surface for air. Failing to keep the air above the water humid enough is probably the #1 reason why some fish keepers have trouble raising these fry to maturity. Nonetheless, I have incredible footage of these fish spawning, but I've decided to use that footage in a separate video. So, if you'd like to see these beautiful fish laying eggs, please continue watching and then look for the link to the spawning video at the conclusion of this presentation. And I can assure you that it's an incredible sight that you won't want to miss. I highly recommend these beautiful fish for a planted tank with subdued lighting where there isn't much of a current. They're very hardy and they adapt well to most water parameters. They're easy to feed and they would make a great centerpiece fish for a peaceful community tank. Their slow and graceful swimming style is very relaxing, and they're one of the most peaceful species out of all of the gouramis. A small group of them would pair nicely with a school of harlequin rasboras and some kuliloches, which would make a great beginning for a Southeast Asian biotope. Well, that's about it for now. If you'd like to help support my effort to continue bringing you these high-quality documentaries, then please consider contributing to this channel in any way that you can. Thanks a lot for watching the video, and I hope you have a beautiful day.